So all right, I've got basically a 5-gallon bucket here, and what I'm going to be showing you is how to make a worm composting bin for creating worm castings. There's a few different styles of worm composting bins. Lots of people will use them for getting rid of kitchen scraps, which is all great, but when you add a lot of kitchen scraps, all sorts of weird shapes and sizes like avocado pits, for example, or pretty much any kind of fruit pit, or tough skins, you end up with a lot of kind of clumpy worm castings. What this does is it enables you to come up with some really light, fluffy worm castings that you can use in your garden. You can create a worm compost tea. You can use them to create start seedlings, which you won't really find soil particles for that. So this is really nice for that. What I'm going to use is just a 5-gallon bucket. I got this one at my work. Where I work, we go through a lot of these, so I bring them home all the time for free. You can also find them at Home Depot or Lowe's. Lowe's has gray ones and Home Depot has orange ones, so I'd probably go with the Lowe's ones. One thing you want to make sure of is that they have an O-ring around the top. If you look right here, you can see there's an O-ring. It's just a little rubber gasket right there, and that is going to keep the worms from falling out. Oftentimes, what will happen is the worms will be able to get out through this through the lid if you don't have an O-ring in there. So it's really important that you have that piece. Then just the basic 5-gallon bucket. It's dirty, but I don't care. What I'm going to do is I'm going to do what's called a worm-proof lid. Because the worms can crawl out, and they do like to crawl out, but you want to have air for them. So I'm going to cut a hole out of the top of the lid about 4 inches wide. If I had a hole saw, I would probably just use that. Because I don't, I'm going to use just a razor blade, as well as I've got my Leatherman, which has a saw on it. So I'm going to go ahead and just cut that out real quick, and that will keep the worms from crawling out. All right? Alright, so I've got my peat moss. I had to run to the store and grab some, but because it's fall, you can usually get a deal on it, which is really nice. With peat moss, you want to make sure you wet it down. And your ideal consistency is so that when you give it a squeeze, you're going to get about a drop or two of water at the bottom. There's one, there's another. But you don't want it too much wetter than that. You don't want it soaking and saturated, but you want it moist. Give the worms a nice place to live. I have heard of some people who sift their peat moss before starting the worm bin, and what that does is at the end you don't have to deal with, like little sticks, like a little stick right there. You don't have to deal with those pieces later when you're harvesting your castings, but I didn't bother with that. I figure I'm going to throw it through the sifter anyway. It's not that big of a deal. So I've got my worm casting, or my peat moss here, and to make sure that the pH is right, I'm going to go ahead and add in a little bit of some lime, because the pH of the peat moss tends to be too acidic, and the lime is going to help neutralize that. So about a handful, about a cup for a bucket is what you want. And if I was smart, I would have added this when it was dry, because it's going to be a lot harder to mix in now. But that's okay, the worms will mix it in for me. Just going to try to get it down to like the first half, top of the half of the bucket. And that should work pretty well. It's just to make sure that it's a good pH for them that they like to live in. The other thing I'm going to do is I'm going to add a handful of just some regular garden dirt. This is going to give them some grit for their gut so that they can help digest everything that they're eating. Keep all the sticks. There's a pine cone. I don't need that in there. Throw some garden dirt. But yeah, grit, they suck that into their gizzard, excuse me, and then they use their gizzard to kind of help them pulverize the food that they eat. And then whatever they don't eat comes out the back end as beautiful worm castings. So I got that in there. Then I'm going to go ahead and add my worms, and I'm just going to bury them down a little bit. I've got a bucket here of some red wigglers. You can see it's not a lot. I'm planning on adding more later. I'm in the middle of doing some more harvesting, but there's a good chunk in there. I'm going to go ahead and drop them in. There are some old castings, so hopefully there's some cocoons and some eggs in there as well, which will open up and have more worms in there. So it's kind of not just worms. Lots of times you'll see people adding just worms. I like to add eggs and cocoons to all of my new bins also, because they'll help the worms to populate faster. So So I'm gonna go ahead and dump those guys in there, bury them with a little bit of peat moss so they're nice and happy. And then I have some food for them. I showed this in another video, and this is just some food that I just made. I haven't frozen it into little ice cubes yet, but it's, let's see, there's banana peels, there's some coffee grounds, there's some spaghetti squash seeds and guts from the inside of the squash. There's some eggshells in here for some more grit and for also some calcium. And I'm just going to add a little bit. I don't want to add too much because we're trying to avoid having fruit flies. We're going to keep this one inside the house. So I'm just going to pour a little bit over this. I'm going to make a little bit of a trough right here. Go ahead and pour this down the middle so they've got some nice food to welcome them into their new home. Gross. If you don't like dealing with some slimy, mucky stuff, you shouldn't get any worms. And then go ahead and just cover that up with the peat moss. Alright, I've got my escape-proof lid. Go ahead and snap that on there. And with this, I'm not going to have to worry about them getting out. I'm not going to have to worry about it staying lit all the time because they can't get past this lid right here. So there you go. In a few months, I'm going to be able to turn this around and harvest just a whole bucket of worm castings, which will be really nice. I'll just have to sift out all the worms. Got the hole in the top so I can get in here. I want to make sure that it stays moist so I can reach in there and give it a squeeze, make sure the peat moss is looking good. One thing I did not do that a lot of other people have done with their worm farms or their worm bins is drill holes in the bottom of the bucket and do like a 2-stage. So what you'll see a lot of times is some people have one bucket that has holes in the bottom. They'll put it inside of another bucket that does not have holes, so that if you overwater it or you add too much food at once and there's too much moisture, that water has a place to drain. My plan is to add very little moisture at a time and make sure that it doesn't get overwatered just by closely monitoring it. So I don't have any holes in this bucket. If you're just getting started and never dealt with worms anymore, it might be a good idea to have 2 buckets, one with holes in it and one without holes, just to make sure that you're not drowning any worms that happen to get to the bottom. But I'm pretty confident that I'm going to be able to do it this way. So that's kind of all there is to it. We'll check back and we'll do an update on this bucket in a few months just to see how it's doing. If you have any questions or you want any further details, kind of get some spec outs of how we did this, go ahead and check out our website. It's byhomestead.com. Thanks very much.